The courtroom was already full when I walked in, which told me everything I needed to know. My parents sat in the front row, close enough to the bench to look cooperative, far enough from the gallery to avoid the whispers. They looked composed, relaxed, familiar with this kind of space. My mother's posture was perfect, hands folded, chin lifted just enough to suggest dignity. My father leaned back slightly, one ankle crossed over the other, as if this were a meeting he expected to win before it began. They smiled when they saw me, not warm smiles, not relieved ones. The kind of smiles people wear when they believe the story has already been decided. I took my seat behind my attorney and felt the weight of the room settle around me. Wood paneling, marble floors, the quiet rustle of paper. This place was designed to make truth feel procedural, orderly, manageable. But I knew better. Truth, when it finally shows up, rarely follows the rules. To anyone watching, this case looks simple. Two well-connected parents, a daughter with a complicated past, a dispute framed as concern, responsibility, clarification. That's the word they liked most. Clarification. They said they only wanted to clarify how things had gone so wrong. I was 27 years old, born and raised in the US, and according to the version of events my parents had been repeating for years, I was difficult, unstable, and estranged by my own choices. A story polished carefully enough that even people who didn't know me believed it. The judge hadn't entered yet. My mother glanced back once more, as if checking whether I still existed in the way she remembered. When our eyes met, her expression tightened briefly before smoothing itself back into practiced concern. She didn't wave. She didn't look away. She looked satisfied. The case title was printed neatly on the docket. Their names versus mine. Equal spacing. Equal font. As if we'd entered this world on equal terms. We hadn't. I was 16 the last time my parents decided who I was. That realization came to me not with anger, but with clarity. Sitting there, listening to the quiet murmur of observers who thought they understood. What kind of daughter takes her parents to court? I felt something settle in my chest. They weren't here to know me. They were here to correct the inconvenience of my existence. The doors at the side of the room opened, and the judge entered. Everyone stood. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. The air shifted. Authority arrived. He took his seat and scanned the room, his gaze moving with practiced neutrality until it reached me. It paused, just for a moment longer than necessary. Not recognition, assessment. Then he looked at my parents. They leaned forward slightly, attentive, ready. This was their element. As the preliminary statements began, I listened carefully, not to the words, but to the tone. My parents' attorney spoke smoothly, framing the situation as regretful but necessary. He described a fractured family, a misunderstanding that had grown over time, a daughter who had withdrawn and rejected reconciliation. He never once said my name. When my attorney responded, he kept it brief, precise, grounded. He didn't argue the story yet. He didn't challenge their framing. He simply stated that facts would matter more than feelings, and records more than reputation. I watched my father's jaw tighten. They hadn't expected that. As the judge outlined the process, my thoughts drifted backward, uninvited, to a much smaller version of myself. Not the child they'd abandoned, not the teenager they disowned, but the girl who learned early what it meant to be rewritten. My parents were excellent narrators. They always had been. They could explain anything until it sounded reasonable, necessary even. When they stopped showing up, they explained it away. When they stopped calling, they reframed it. When they signed papers that made their absence official, they told themselves it was temporary. By the time I understood what had been taken from me, they'd already convinced themselves it had been my fault. That story followed me everywhere. School records, legal documents, conversations with adults who thought they were helping. It became easier to let it stand than to fight it, until it wasn't. The judge asked my parents to confirm their intent. My mother spoke first. Her voice trembled slightly, just enough to sound sincere. She said they only wanted answers, that they were worried, that they feared I'd been influenced, misled, cut off from them unfairly. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue that appeared from nowhere. My father nodded along, his expression solemn, controlled. I felt no urge to interrupt. Let them pretend. The judge turned to me next. Do you understand why we're here today? He asked. Yes, I said. My voice didn't shake. I didn't raise it either. It landed somewhere in between, steady and unadorned. And do you intend to cooperate fully with this court? I already am, I replied. That earned a few glances from the gallery. The judge studied me again. Longer this time. Not with suspicion. With something closer to curiosity. We hadn't reached the evidence yet. We hadn't reached the contradictions. We hadn't reached the part where their story would begin to strain under its own weight. But sitting there, with my parents so confident and so certain, I realized something important. They weren't afraid of losing. They were afraid of being questioned. And this time, I wasn't going to save them from that. People assume estrangement happens all at once. Like a door slamming shut. It does end single quotes t. It happens in increments so small you don't notice them until you're standing somewhere unfamiliar, trying to remember how you got there. I was 16 when my parents decided I was too much, not in anger, not during a fight. They said it calmly, almost kindly, as if they were diagnosing a weather pattern instead of abandoning their child. I remember the kitchen light buzzing overhead while my mother stood by the counter, arms crossed, rehearsed patience on her face. My father stayed seated, eyes fixed on the table, like he couldn't bear to look at me while explaining why he no longer could. This isn't working, my mother said. You're resistant. You don't communicate. We've tried everything. Tried everything meant therapy sessions where they spoke for me. Family meetings where my feelings were labeled as defiance. Silence framed as disrespect. I asked where I was supposed to go. My father finally looked up then. You'll figure it out, he said. You always do. That was the night I learned independence can be forced. I moved between relatives for a while. Short stays, polite smiles, conversations whispered just out of earshot. I became a temporary problem. People were careful not to adopt. My parents explained my absence the way they explained everything else. She needed space. She asked for this. She's complicated. The story traveled faster than I did. By the time I turned 18, the distance was official, legal, documented. They signed papers that made it easier to pretend I had chosen all of it. I learned later that they described it as mercy, letting me go, giving me freedom. Freedom is an interesting word when you don't have a home. What surprised me wasn't that they let go. It was how quickly they replaced me. New routines, new priorities, new stories that didn't include my name. They attended events and smiled for photos and spoke about family values without hesitation. I learned to live quietly, to work without attracting attention, to answer questions with less truth than they deserved. It was easier that way. For a long time, I believed the version of myself they had repeated. Difficult, ungrateful, hard to love. It took years to unlearn that. Sitting in the courtroom now, listening to them speak with such practiced concern, I could almost admire the consistency. They hadn't changed their language in over a decade. They still spoke as if they were managing a problem, not confronting a consequence. My mother's testimony painted me as distant but confused, withdrawn but influenced. She spoke about missed calls and unanswered messages without mentioning the years she never dialed my number. My father nodded along, occasionally adding phrases like "we tried and we were worried." Worried is easy to say when you never show up. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't revisit the past in detail. I didn't list nights spent sleeping on couches or the jobs I took before I was old enough to drink. I didn't describe the shame of filling out forms that asked for emergency contacts I didn't have. I simply answered the questions asked. Yes, I left the house at 16. No, I wasn't given a choice. Yes, we were legally estranged by 18. No, reconciliation was never pursued by them afterward. Each answer was a small weight added to the room. I could feel the gallery shifting. The quiet discomfort of people realizing the story they'd accepted was missing pieces. Not dramatic pieces, mundane ones. The kind that don't make headlines but change everything. My parents watched me carefully now. This wasn't the version of me they remembered. This wasn't the teenager they could dismiss with a sigh and a diagnosis. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't reactive. I wasn't asking for anything. That unsettled them. Estrangement had always been their shield. Proof, in their minds, that distance was mutual. That whatever followed wasn't their responsibility. But estrangement only protects you if the other person stays silent. I hadn't stayed silent. I'd just been quiet. The judge asked about my life since then. Education, employment, stability. I answered without embellishment. No bitterness. No triumph. Just facts. I'd worked. I'd studied. I'd built a life that functioned without them. that seemed to confuse my mother more than anything else. She looked at me as if searching for the moment she'd missed. The turning point where I'd become someone she no longer recognized. As if my survival itself was an accusation. What she didn't understand was that survival doesn't require permission. By the end of the session, the air felt heavier. Not with tension, but with awareness. The easy assumptions had started to fray. No conclusions yet. No judgments announced, but the version of me they'd carried into that room no longer fit. And for the first time since I was 16, that mattered. There's a moment in every long conflict when the story people believe begins to wobble. It doesn't shatter. Not yet. It just loses its balance, tilts slightly. Enough that those paying attention feel the shift. That moment arrived for my parents when paperwork entered the room. Up until then, everything had been narrative, emotion, memory framed as concern. My parents were good at that part. They spoke in impressions, not facts. In what they felt, not what they could prove. For years, that had been enough. Most people don't ask for receipts when the speaker sounds sincere. This court did, when my attorney stood and announced that we would be submitting records related to my estrangement. The air changed. My father straightened. My mother's fingers tightened around her tissue. They both looked faintly irritated, as if someone had violated an unspoken agreement about how this was supposed to go. The first document was simple. A dated letter, signed by both of them, requesting formal separation of guardianship responsibilities when I was still a minor. No accusations, no drama, just language. Clear, deliberate. My mother frowned as it appeared on the screen. That was temporary, she said quickly. We were overwhelmed. We needed time. My attorney didn't argue. He simply introduced the next record, and then the next. Emails, legal filings, school correspondence, each one ordinary on its own, together unmistakable. The timeline spoke for itself. Estrangement hadn't been accidental. Distance hadn't been mutual. Silence hadn't been confusion. It had been a decision. I watched my parents as the judge reviewed the documents. Not closely, not with satisfaction, just enough to see the shift happen in real time. My father stopped nodding along. My mother stopped offering commentary. They were recalculating. That was new. Their attorney attempted to reframe. He spoke about context, about stress, about how complicated family dynamics could be. He used words like miscommunication and misunderstanding, as if enough syllables could blur dates and signatures. The judge listened. Then he asked a question. Were these decisions contested at the time? The room went quiet. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father cleared his throat. No, he admitted. They were not. That single answer did more than any argument could have. For the first time, the court wasn't weighing stories. It was weighing responsibility. I was asked when I'd first seen these records. Years ago, I replied. And why were they not challenged then? The judge asked. Because I was 16, I thought. Because I didn't have resources. Because no one explained my options. What I said was simpler. I didn't have the power to. I said calmly. That seemed to land. The rest of the morning unfolded slowly, deliberately. Each record introduced added structure where there had once been suggestion. Each confirmation narrowed the space my parents had relied on to maneuver. They grew quieter as the hours passed. Their confidence didn't vanish, but it tightened, became brittle. During a recess, my mother leaned toward me for the first time since proceedings began. You planned this, she whispered, her voice low, sharp. I met her eyes. I remembered it. She recoiled slightly, as if the difference mattered. It did. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge requested clarification on another point. This one about contact, frequency, initiation. My father's attorney hesitated before responding. He cited general attempts, unsuccessful outreach, good intentions. My attorney produced phone records, dates, numbers, gaps. I wasn't surprised. I'd lived those gaps. Years of birthdays marked by silence, holidays without acknowledgement, messages left unanswered. What surprised me was how uncomfortable the room became when those absences were made visible. Neglect is easy to deny when it's invisible. On paper, it looks different. By the end of the day, the tone had shifted completely. Not hostile, not accusatory, serious. The judge didn't announce conclusions. He didn't need to. His questions told me enough. They were no longer about my credibility. They were about my parents' decisions. As we packed up to leave, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of the courtroom doors. I looked the same, neutral, composed, but something fundamental had changed. The story they'd brought with them was no longer standing alone. It had competition now, and it was losing. By the second day, the courtroom felt different, not louder, not tenser, just heavier, as if the air itself had absorbed the weight of what was being said and refused to let it dissipate. The confidence my parents had walked in with was still there technically, but it no longer moved freely. It had edges. Now, it caught on questions. It hesitated. That was how I knew the shift was real. Stories can survive emotion. They struggle with structure. My parents' case depended on implication, on suggestion, on the idea that concern could substitute for consistency. But once the records were laid out, once dates and signatures replaced memory and tone, their story began to lose its footing. They adjusted quickly. They had always been good at that. Their attorney reframed again, this time with more urgency. He spoke about parental fear, about not knowing how to help a troubled child. He used phrases like protective distance and measured disengagement, dressing abandonment in professional language. The judge let him finish. Then he asked my mother a question directly. When was the last time you initiated contact with your daughter before this filing? She didn't answer right away. I watched her eyes flicker, the way they always did when she was calculating. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but something underneath it had tightened. I don't remember the exact date. The judge nodded. Within a year? A pause. Possibly. Within 5 years? Another pause, longer this time. I'd need to check, she said. The judge turned to my attorney. Do we have that information? We do, he replied, already standing. The records appeared again. Clean, precise, unemotional. The last outgoing message from my mother was dated over 8 years earlier. A single voicemail. Polite, vague, never followed up. My mother stared at the screen, her lips pressed thin. That was the moment I saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear, not of losing the case, of losing control of the narrative, because what was slipping wasn't just credibility. It was authorship. They had always been the ones to explain things, to summarize, to interpret, to decide what mattered and what didn't. Now the court was doing that for them, and it wasn't reaching the same conclusions. My father spoke next. His tone was calmer, more restrained. He leaned into reason, into practicality. He said distance had seemed appropriate, that emotions were high. That time had passed. Time, he suggested, should soften judgment, but time only softens wounds that were tended to. Neglect just hardens. The judge asked about legal responsibility, about choices made when I was still a minor, about alternatives considered. Each question narrowed the space my parents had been moving in. I didn't speak much that day. I didn't need to. When I did, it was to confirm facts, to answer directly, to avoid interpretation. The less I said, the more their words echoed. During a break, my father approached my attorney instead of me. He spoke quietly, his voice edged with irritation. This is getting out of hand, he said. She's making us look cruel, my attorney replied evenly. The documents are doing that. That was the truth of it. Cruelty doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like absence, like decisions made quietly and never revisited, like children who grow up learning not to ask. As proceedings continued, I noticed the gallery again. Faces that had come expecting spectacle now watched with discomfort, not pity for me, recognition. People were recalibrating. The easy assumptions they'd brought with them no longer fit the evidence in front of them. And once assumptions crack, people become very aware of how easily they formed them. By the end of the afternoon, the judge announced an adjournment. He didn't comment on outcomes. He didn't need to. His questions had already rewritten the frame. As we stood to leave, my mother avoided my eyes entirely. My father lingered a moment longer, looking at me as if trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the version he'd carried for years. I felt no urge to help him. Outside, the hallway buzzed with low voices. Reporters whispered. Assistants made calls. Somewhere down the corridor, my parents' attorney was already strategizing, already trying to patch what had begun to tear. I walked past them quietly. The story they'd relied on was still standing, but it was listing now, and everyone in the room could see it. The third morning began with a quiet I hadn't felt before, not anticipation, not dread, something steadier. as if the room itself had reached a conclusion and was now waiting for everyone else to catch up. My parents arrived later than usual. Their movements were tighter, more deliberate. My mother's expression had shifted from practiced concern to something brittle, her composure held together by habit rather than confidence. My father said very little, his attention fixed on the table in front of him. Fingers tracing the edge of a legal pad without writing anything down. They no longer looked certain. The judge entered, and the room rose again. When we sat, he didn't begin with statements. He went straight to questions. Before we continue, he said, looking first at my parents' counsel, then at mine. I want clarity on one point. He turned to my father. When your daughter was 16, he asked, did you believe she posed a danger to herself or others? The question landed like a dropped object, not loud, but impossible to ignore. My father hesitated. No, he said carefully. She was difficult but not dangerous. The judge nodded once. Did she suffer from any diagnosed condition that would have required protective separation? No, my father said again, his voice quieter now. The judge shifted his gaze to my mother. Did you seek court intervention at the time? She swallowed. No. Did you attempt supervised reconciliation in the years that followed? No. Did you provide financial or emotional support after formal estrangement? Silence. The judge waited. No, she said finally. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal that something had settled. Then he asked the question that changed everything. If none of those conditions were present, he said evenly. On what basis do you now claim your daughter was manipulated or coerced into independence? The room went still. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father's jaw tightened. Their attorney stood quickly, trying to intervene, reframing, offering context. The judge raised a hand. I asked a specific question. No one answered, because there was no answer that didn't contradict everything they had already said. That was when I understood how fragile their position had become. Not because of anything I'd done recently, but because the truth they were trying to replace had too much structure behind it. The judge turned to me. Do you recall being offered support or reconciliation after separation? He asked. I do not, I replied. Did you refuse contact? No. Or conditions placed on your return? Yes. What were they? That I acknowledge fault, I said calmly, without explanation. The judge nodded again. Slowly. That was enough. The remainder of the day unfolded like gravity doing its work. My parents' attorney attempted to recover, but the energy was gone. Each question now exposed a gap they couldn't close. Each attempt to regain control only highlighted how little of it remained. My mother took the stand again, her performance less polished this time. The tears came too quickly. The explanations circled themselves. She spoke of disappointment, of fear, of not knowing what else to do. But fear without action is just an excuse. The judge listened. Then he asked her one final question. Did you ever ask your daughter what she needed? She stared at him. No, she admitted. That was it. There was no drama after that. No raised voices. No accusations. Just a quiet understanding settling across the room. When the judge called for a recess before closing arguments, my parents didn't look at me. They gathered their things with the careful movements of people who know something has slipped beyond their reach. Outside the courtroom, I stood alone for a moment, breathing in the stillness. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. Some truths don't explode. They sink, and once they do, they don't resurface the same way. The verdict didn't come with fanfare. There was no dramatic pause, no theatrical reading meant for an audience. The judge returned after a short recess, settled into his chair, and delivered his decision the way people do when the answer has been obvious for a while and everyone else is just catching up. He dismissed their claims in full. No undue influence, no coercion, no evidence of manipulation. What he did acknowledge, clearly and without hesitation, was a long pattern of voluntary disengagement on my parents' part, followed by a sudden interest only when control was no longer theirs. The language was precise, unemotional. Final. As his words landed, the courtroom exhaled. My parents didn't react right away. My father stared straight ahead, his expression fixed, as if he were waiting for someone to interrupt and correct what had just been said. My mother's face went blank, the careful performance finally exhausting itself. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked unsure of what expression to wear. I felt something loosen in my chest, not triumph, Not relief exactly, release. The judge concluded with a reminder that courts exist to establish responsibility, not rewrite history to make it more comfortable. Then he stood, nodded once, and left the room. That was it. No gavel strike. That echoed in my memory. No closing speech. Just a door opening and closing, and a chapter ending with less noise than I'd imagined. As people began to gather their things, conversations resumed in low murmurs. Observers avoided eye contact, suddenly aware they'd witnessed something intimate, not entertaining. My attorney leaned toward me and said quietly, "It's over." I nodded. Across the aisle, my parents spoke urgently to their lawyer. Their voices were hushed but strained. They didn't look at me, not once. It was as if acknowledging me now would require admitting something they weren't ready to face. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and waited. On my way out, my mother reached for my arm. Her grip was light but insistent. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice low. Not angry, not pleading, defensive. I looked at her hand on my sleeve, then back at her face. "I didn't," I said. "You did. A long time ago." She released me as if my words had burned. Outside the courthouse, the sky was pale and overcast, the kind of day that feels unfinished. A few reporters lingered near the steps, unsure whether there was still a story worth chasing. I walked past them without stopping. For years, my parents had defined me by absence. By what I didn't do. By who I wasn't. That power dissolved the moment I stopped needing their recognition to exist. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded. The case stopped being newsworthy. People moved on. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, and I returned to mine. What surprised me wasn't how much lighter I felt, but how solid. I didn't feel the urge to prove anything anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. The record existed. The truth had been documented. I didn't need to carry it alone. One evening, I sat in my apartment, the windows open, the city settling into its nighttime quiet. I thought about the girl I'd been at 16, standing in a kitchen with buzzing lights, being told she was too difficult to keep. I wished I could tell her this, that survival wasn't the end goal. That clarity would come. That one day, she'd speak in rooms where her parents could no longer speak for her. I didn't feel hatred toward them. I didn't feel forgiveness either. What I felt was separation, not estrangement forced by paperwork or silence, but a clean, deliberate boundary. A knowing of where they ended and I began. For the first time, my life felt authored by me. No explanations, no footnotes, no corrections, just forward motion, and that was enough.